In the early 1900s, a young boy named Gene Otto of Key West, Florida, received a peculiar and unsettling gift for his birthday, an oversized doll, about 40 inches tall, dressed in a sailor's outfit, and with glassy, lifeless eyes. It wasn't just a simple toy, but an object that would soon be known as Robert the Doll, one of the most terrifying artifacts in history. Gene's parents, wealthy and well-known in the community, had no idea that the seemingly innocent gift was not just a doll but an ancient vessel of dark energy. The origins of the doll were shrouded in mystery. It is believed that Robert was given to Gene by a servant, a woman of dark spiritual practices, possibly from the Caribbean. She had a background tied to black magic, and it was rumored that she imbued the doll with malevolent energy before handing it over to Gene. Some locals believed that this woman had intended to curse the family, perhaps out of revenge or out of a twisted sense of power. When Gene took the doll into his arms, little did anyone know it would forever change his life and the lives of those around him. Soon after receiving Robert, the family began to notice strange and inexplicable occurrences around the house. It started small. Furniture would be slightly displaced and objects would be found in places they shouldn't be. At first, these events were dismissed as mere coincidences or misplacements. But as the days went on, the happenings grew more frequent and more disturbing. No one could have predicted how far the doll's sinister influence would extend. The doll's presence, dark and powerful, soon became undeniable. Even the weather seemed to shift when Robert was nearby, as if the atmosphere itself was aware of the doll's dark power. But it wasn't just the furniture and objects that started behaving oddly. Gene's behavior began to change too. No longer the innocent child his parents had raised, Gene started speaking to Robert as if it were alive, as though the doll were a sentient being, capable of thought, emotion, and even control. His parents were horrified to witness Gene's growing attachment to the doll. He would take Robert everywhere with him, often speaking to it as though it were his best friend. His conversations with Robert became more troubling with time. Sometimes Gene would argue with the doll as if Robert were talking back, even though the doll had not moved or made a sound. But it wasn't just the strange behavior. It was the doll's apparent influence over Gene that made his parents uneasy. Their son was no longer the child they had known. Robert had taken root in their home, and with it, the family's nightmare was only beginning. As Gene grew more withdrawn, his once cheerful personality was replaced by an eerily cold demeanor. He would blame the doll for every mishap around the house: broken dishes, shattered glass, overturned furniture. At first, his parents thought he was just being imaginative, but the events continued to escalate, and Gene began to insist that Robert was responsible. The doll wasn't just a toy anymore. It was something far darker, something alive and in control. And that, far from being the worst, was just the beginning of a series of terrifying events that would plague the Otto family for years. Gene's doll, Robert, wasn't just any toy. It was the product of something much darker than anyone could have imagined. It is widely believed that Robert was a gift from a servant who practiced black magic. The servant, whose name has been lost to history, is said to have had a strong connection to the occult. Her knowledge of the spiritual world was far from ordinary, and she is rumored to have used the doll to cast a curse on the Otto family. This woman had a deep understanding of the supernatural, particularly in the realm of voodoo and witchcraft, and many believe that she was trying to send a powerful message to the family, though the exact reason for her curse remains unknown. Some historians speculate that the servant's feelings of resentment or anger toward the family led her to use the doll as a vessel for the dark powers she wielded. It is said that she had a deep-rooted grudge against the Ottos, but the true reason remains shrouded in mystery. Some claim she was angry about being mistreated by the family, while others believe she may have been involved in something far more sinister. Regardless of the reasons, what is clear is that when she gave the doll to young Gene, she didn't just give him a toy. She gave him a link to the spirit world, a dangerous conduit to something dark and malevolent. Legend holds that the servant performed a ritual before gifting the doll, filling it with a dark spirit that would forever bind Gene and Robert together. This curse was not just a typical hex. No, this curse had a specific purpose: to slowly possess Gene's soul and wreak havoc on the family. After receiving the doll, Gene's life took a disturbing turn, and the family was soon plagued by a series of supernatural occurrences that they couldn't explain. As Gene began to change, becoming more erratic and withdrawn, it became clear that the doll wasn't just a toy. It was alive, and it had power. For years, the Otto family tried to understand what had happened to their son. Was he simply playing with a doll, or was something far more sinister at play? As Gene spent more time with Robert, it was as though the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred, and the doll itself seemed to command his actions. Every time Gene looked at Robert, he seemed to see something more than just a doll, something dark, something alive, staring back at him. The powerful curse placed on Robert had taken hold of Gene, and now the young boy's soul was trapped under the doll's malevolent influence. As Gene continued to spend every waking moment with Robert, his attachment to the doll grew more intense. The once innocent child began to exhibit increasingly strange behavior. He would talk to Robert as though it were a living, breathing entity, as if the doll had its own voice, its own mind, and its own power. His parents, already disturbed by the bizarre occurrences happening around the house, were now witnessing their son's obsessive attachment to the doll. Gene would often argue with Robert, even accusing the doll of causing trouble, but always with the unsettling belief that Robert could respond. One day, Gene's parents heard him having an intense conversation with Robert in his room. It wasn't unusual for Gene to talk to the doll, but this time, the words that came out of his mouth were nothing short of chilling. Gene claimed that Robert was telling him to do things, giving him instructions that didn't make sense, things that felt twisted and dangerous. His parents dismissed it at first, but the more they observed, the more they realized that this wasn't normal behavior for a young child. Gene was acting under Robert's influence. His interactions with the doll seemed to go beyond mere imagination. Something supernatural was at work, and the closer Gene got to the doll, the more distant he became from reality. As Gene grew older, the attachment didn't diminish. In fact, it only deepened. He kept Robert by his side at all times, even when he wasn't playing with it. The doll became an extension of Gene, as though it were part of him and he part of it. Gene began to act differently. He no longer seemed like the boy his parents had raised. He became withdrawn, eerie, and even dangerous. It was as if Robert had taken over his mind, controlling him from the shadows. Every time Gene looked at the doll, he saw something dark, something that wasn't just a toy, but a vessel of evil. And no matter what he did, Gene couldn't escape its grasp. At times, Gene would act as though Robert had told him to do things that terrified his parents. He would claim that Robert had caused mischief around the house, things that were impossible to explain. Dishes would be broken, furniture would be overturned, and doors would be mysteriously locked or unlocked. Each time these events happened, Gene would look at Robert and insist that the doll was the one behind it. But his parents couldn't make sense of it. Could it really be Robert causing the trouble? Or was it something else? Something far darker and far more dangerous than they could ever understand. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the Otto family began to experience an escalating series of disturbing events. At first, the changes were subtle, slight disturbances, things out of place that could easily be dismissed as mere accidents. But as time passed, the occurrences grew increasingly violent and erratic. Furniture in the house would be found overturned in the morning. Objects that had once been carefully arranged would be scattered across the rooms, and items, sometimes heavy ones, would be mysteriously moved from one spot to another. Jean's parents, growing more concerned, initially chalked it up to their son's imagination, assuming he was responsible for the mischief. But it wasn't just the child's behavior that was starting to get more bizarre. It was the atmosphere in the house itself. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though something unseen and sinister was lingering just beyond the threshold of their understanding. A pervasive unease settled over the family. The house itself seemed to become a living thing, shifting, breathing, and pulsating with a malevolent force that could not be explained. Jean, on the other hand, was becoming more obsessive. He began to speak of the doll as though it had control over him, blaming Robert for everything that went wrong. It wasn't just broken dishes or misplaced items. Jean now claimed that Robert was actively causing the chaos around the house. His parents grew desperate. At night, they would often hear Jean talking to the doll in his room, having lengthy conversations that no one could hear or understand. But the oddest part was that the conversations seemed uneven, almost as if there were two voices. Jean would speak, and then there would be a second voice, quieter and more distant. At first, his parents assumed it was just the child's imagination running wild. But when they went into Jean's room, the air was colder than normal, and Robert would be found in a different position than the night before, sometimes sitting in a chair, other times lying on the floor, and at times, his hands and eyes would seem to be directed in the direction of whoever entered the room. It was as if the doll was aware of its surroundings, aware of who was coming and going, and perhaps even manipulating the very room itself. It wasn't just the house that felt different. It was the very atmosphere around the Otto family. Jean's mother and father, once proud and content, became withdrawn and anxious, each of them wondering if they were the only ones feeling this strange unease. The house was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a trap, a prison where the unnatural had taken root and seemed to control every aspect of their lives. They would often hear scratching sounds at night, coming from the walls or beneath the floorboards. They couldn't explain it, nor could they escape it. It was as though something or someone was trying to communicate with them, but the message was lost in the void, leaving them with an unsettling feeling of impending doom. Jean's parents tried everything they could to make sense of what was happening. They brought in friends, neighbors, even local religious figures to bless the house, but it only seemed to escalate the events. The blessings were followed by more violent disturbances, broken windows, overturned vases, and loud crashing noises. It was as though the house itself was rejecting any efforts to push the curse out. The more they fought it, the stronger it became. Eventually, Jean's parents came to a horrifying conclusion. Robert was the source. The doll was at the heart of the family's nightmare, a vessel for something otherworldly that had taken control of their lives. The presence of Robert in their home had transformed it into something unrecognizable, a place where no one was safe. And though the family tried to dismiss it, there was one undeniable truth. The house, and the curse of Robert, was alive. The more time Jean spent with Robert, the more he began to change. It wasn't just the oddities around the house. It was Jean himself. His personality seemed to shift, and the once joyful, curious child began to exhibit strange and troubling behavior. It started with withdrawn moments, where Jean would sit in silence, staring at the doll for hours, as if in some sort of trance. His eyes would seem vacant, as though he wasn't fully present. And when he did speak, His voice would often be different, deeper, more unsettling, almost as if someone else. But the real change came when Jean began arguing with the doll. His parents at first thought it was just childish behavior, a boy playing with his toy, perhaps pretending the doll could talk back. But the conversations Jean had with Robert grew more intense. He would become visibly upset, his voice rising, his fist clenched as if in a heated argument. Sometimes Jean would even accuse Robert of causing the mischief in the house, blaming the doll for everything, from broken dishes to objects mysteriously moving around. But the most chilling aspect of it all was the fact that Jean didn't seem to be in control of his own actions. It was as though Robert was commanding him and Jean was simply following orders. At times, it seemed like the doll had a power over Jean that extended beyond the ordinary. His eyes would lock with Robert's, and it was as though a silent understanding passed between them, a communication that didn't need words. And when Jean would speak of Robert, he would describe him not as a doll but as a living being, a presence that had influence over him. It was as though Robert was more than just a toy. He was a force that Jean could not escape, no matter how much he tried. Jean's parents tried to intervene, but nothing seemed to work. They would take the doll away, only for Jean to scream in terror, demanding it be returned. He would become inconsolable, his behavior turning aggressive. When they finally gave the doll back, Jean would revert to his quiet, withdrawn state, and the strange incidents around the house would begin again. One evening, after a particularly violent outburst, Jean's mother found him sitting on the floor, holding Robert in his lap. His expression was unreadable, but the doll's face seemed to change, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. It was in that moment that Jean's mother realized that Robert was not just a doll. It was a possessor, a malevolent entity that had taken root inside her son, and the worst part was, she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop it. The night Jean screamed for help would forever be etched in the Otto family's memory. It was a night like any other. Jean was playing in his room with Robert, as he often did when suddenly his screams echoed through the house. His parents rushed to his room, hearts pounding in their chests, only to find the door locked from the inside. When they finally managed to open it, they were met with an unsettling
scene.
The furniture was overturned as usual, but what truly terrified them was the sight of Robert sitting at the window, staring out at them. Jean was on the floor, visibly shaken, his body trembling in fear. He looked at his parents with wide eyes and whispered, "Robert locked me in here." His parents, stunned and confused, tried to make sense of what had just happened. But Jean's story was nonsensical. How could the doll have locked him in? Robert had no hands, no feet. It was impossible. Yet Jean swore that the doll had somehow controlled the room, trapping him inside. The more they questioned Jean, the more agitated he became. He clutched Robert tightly, his fingers digging into the doll's fabric as if trying to protect it, or perhaps protect himself from something far worse. Jean's parents could see the fear in his eyes, but they could not understand it. How could a doll, just a toy, have such an influence on their son? How could it have taken control of their home, their lives, their very souls? But one thing was certain. Robert was no ordinary doll. It had become something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. And as the Otto family stood there, staring at the doll in the window, they realized that they were no longer in control of their own fate. Robert was in charge. As the disturbing events around the Otto family continued to unfold, the effects of Robert's malevolent influence began to tear the family apart. Jean, once a happy and playful child, was now a shadow of his former self. His attachment to the doll grew deeper with each passing day, and his parents could no longer recognize the son they had once known. The child they had raised was slowly becoming possessed, and it seemed that Robert was at the center of it all. The household, once warm and full of laughter, had become a place of constant fear and dread. Jean's parents tried their best to intervene. They tried reasoning with him. They tried taking the doll away, but it was always the same. Jean would become inconsolable, screaming in terror, begging for Robert to be returned. At times, the doll would even appear in different places throughout the house as if it were moving on its own. The family would find it sitting on the windowsill, or sometimes positioned at the foot of Jean's bed, its glassy eyes staring out at them unblinking. The tension between Jean and his parents grew unbearable. His mother, at her wits' end, began to fear for her own safety. The doll wasn't just tormenting her son, it was destroying their family. The more she tried to intervene, the more violent the repercussions became. Jean's behavior turned aggressive. He would lash out at anyone who tried to take Robert from him, his once gentle demeanor now replaced with hostility and a kind of rage that his parents had never seen before. His father, who had once been skeptical of the doll's supernatural nature, now found himself questioning his sanity. How could a simple toy have so much power? How could it drive his son to such extremes? The fear that gripped the household was palpable, and each day became more of a struggle to simply exist under the same roof. But it wasn't just the family dynamic that was falling apart. Jean's social life was also beginning to deteriorate. He became withdrawn, refusing to leave the house, and whenever he did, it was only to go to the local store to purchase things for Robert. His friends, once close and playful, no longer came over, and the neighborhood children stayed clear of him. It was as though the dark aura surrounding Robert had spread, infecting Jean with a sense of isolation and paranoia. There were rumors circulating around Key West that Jean and his family were haunted by a cursed doll, but those who dared speak about it in hushed tones always seemed to disappear, vanishing without a trace. Eventually, the Otto family's house became an abandoned shell of what it once was. The windows were always shut and the doors were locked. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house late at night, but no one dared go near. The family had been consumed by Robert, the doll at the center of the madness. The destruction was not just physical or emotional, it was spiritual. It was as though the very essence of the Otto family had been possessed by evil, and there was no escape. Their lives, once so full of promise, had been reduced to empty shells, and the only thing that remained was Robert, watching, waiting, and feeding off the darkness it had created. Desperation soon led Jean's parents to try every possible means to rid their home of the cursed doll. With every method they tried, they seemed to be met with failure. Spiritual leaders were called in to perform exorcisms. Priests, shamans, and mystics came to the Otto house to cleanse it of the evil that had taken hold of their son. And yet, each time they tried, it only seemed to escalate the haunting. One priest who visited the house claimed that Robert was not just a doll, but a vessel for a malevolent spirit, one that had taken control of Jean. The priest, unnerved by the powerful presence in the house, eventually left in a state of shock, muttering that the evil was beyond his ability to understand. Even as the attempts to rid the house of Robert grew more extreme, the doll itself seemed to remain impervious to all efforts. It was as if the spirit inside it was growing stronger, feeding off the fear and misery of the family. One of the more chilling incidents occurred when a local voodoo priestess was summoned to try and break the curse. After hours of chanting and performing rituals, the priestess turned to the family with a look of sheer terror on her face. She claimed that she had seen something in Robert's eyes, something that wasn't just a doll, but a powerful entity that had been bound to the doll for years. She warned them that any further attempts to get rid of it could unleash something far worse. The priestess advised that they leave the doll alone, but it was clear that she did not understand just how deep Robert's control had gone over Jean. The more they tried to distance themselves from the doll, the more Jean grew agitated and violent. In a final act of desperation, Jean's parents decided to lock Robert away. hoping that by keeping him hidden they would break the curse. But once again, their attempts were met with failure. The very next day, when they returned to check on the doll, they found Robert in the exact spot they had left him, but his expression had changed. His glassy eyes seemed to gleam with a new malicious intensity, and he appeared to be staring directly at them. It was as though the doll had brought itself back to life and it was mocking their attempts to rid themselves of it. The family's final attempt to rid themselves of Robert involved burning the doll. They set it on fire in the yard, hoping to destroy it once and for all. But even then, the supernatural force seemed to fight back. The flame sputtered and died, and the doll remained unscathed, its sailor suit still pristine, its eyes still gleaming with an eerie life of their own. And so, the Otto family's final hope was extinguished. The doll was too powerful, too malevolent, to be destroyed. With every failed attempt to rid themselves of the curse, Robert's power seemed to grow stronger. It became clear that the doll was no ordinary object. It was a portal, a vessel for something ancient and sinister. Those who came in contact with it would find their lives unraveling in ways they could not comprehend. Gene, once a vibrant young boy, had become a shell of the person he had been, completely under Robert's control. But Robert wasn't done with him yet. The doll began to show signs of a greater power, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Otto family home. Robert's influence began to spread beyond the walls of the house, reaching out into the town of Key West itself. People who had never met the Ottos began to feel the doll's power, experiencing strange occurrences and unsettling feelings of dread. Visitors to the Otto home would report feeling watched by an unseen presence, and some even claimed to hear whispers coming from Robert's direction when the doll was left alone. The doll's malevolent presence was unmistakable. Gene's fate was sealed, but it was becoming clear that Robert was not content to just possess one person. As the stories of strange occurrences grew, it became apparent that Robert had the power to corrupt entire communities, feeding on their fear, using its influence to bend them to its will. The Otto family, once prosperous and proud, had become the vessel for something much greater, something beyond their understanding. And now, Robert's curse had no bounds. Years passed, and the once bright and hopeful Gene Otto was now an old man. But despite the passage of time, the memory of Robert never left him. He had grown accustomed to living with the cursed doll, almost as if it were a part of him. The doll's dark influence had not only consumed his childhood, but it had extended its hold over him for his entire life. Gene's family had long since left the house, unable to live under its oppressive presence. But Gene, alone and consumed, remained. On the night of his death, Gene was found clutching Robert to his chest, as though he had never been able to escape its hold. And as he passed, it was said that his final words were a soft whisper. "Robert, take care of them." The doll, now left alone in the empty house, seemed to stare into the darkness, waiting. And as the world around it fell silent, it was clear that Robert's power had not diminished, but had only grown stronger with time. As years passed, Robert's curse did not fade with time. The doll's story, filled with fear and mystery, became legendary in Key West. Eventually, Robert was moved to a museum dedicated to the supernatural. But the idea of placing the doll in a public setting was not done lightly. Those who had handled Robert over the years warned the museum staff about the doll's powerful and unsettling presence. At first, the museum staff thought they could contain the curse by locking the doll in a glass case. Visitors would come, intrigued by the tale of Robert, but many would leave with an overwhelming sense of dread and unease. It was said that some would walk away with strange markings or find that their lives began to spiral into chaos after simply gazing at Robert. Others reported nightmares that felt too real, where Robert's expression seemed to shift in the dark of the night. One evening, the museum's manager, unaware of the warnings, decided to take a photo of Robert to document his exhibition. The moment the flash went off, the camera malfunctioned. The photo appeared distorted, with a dark, shadowy figure standing behind the doll, as though Robert was no longer alone in his glass case. The museum manager tried to delete the image, but no matter how hard he tried, the photograph refused to be erased. The fear among the staff grew as they realized the museum was no longer just showcasing a haunted object. It had become a magnet for supernatural activity. Those who dared speak of Robert in the museum would often hear whispers in the hallways, or feel cold drafts brush past them, though all the windows were closed. Visitors began to leave warnings on social media. Do not visit if you value peace of mind. Robert had once again become more than just a doll. He was a curse, infecting everyone who came into his orbit. The doll's malevolent grip was far from over, and as the museum's doors closed each night, Robert sat silently in his case, waiting for the next soul to come too close.